Welcome everyone to our webinar today. We would like to discuss a very interesting topic today, and I'm very excited to share the discussion today with very distinguished panels. It's a group of great experts that we have today that would like to share their views with you on decentralized finance and what actually is new about it. And it's a big buzzword that floats around nowadays across at least EU bubble, but also in the FT. Globally, it's heavily discussed, and we want to shed some light today on this topic. And for that reason, we invited, and I start with no particular order, as I see them on my screen, Joachim Schwerin, Principal Economist of the European Commission from DG Grow, Thomas Dünser, Director of the Office of Financial Market Innovation from the Government of Liechtenstein, Anne Klutz from the University of Cambridge. She's a lecturer focused on decentralized finance and blockchain with a legal angle. And then last but not least, Fabian Scher, he's professor at the University of Basel, equally interested in DeFi and blockchain. And I would like to welcome you all to, if you have any questions, send them to the chat or the Q&A function, and I will try to incorporate them in our discussion. Just for you to give you an idea about what we want to do today, we would like to take a normative approach to what DeFi is or can be, how regulators can or should look at it and think about it, and then hopefully have a discussion about the exciting parts as well as the new challenges that arise from this new innovation. And for that reason, we'll have two presentations at the beginning. So Fabian and Thomas will give an overview about DeFi more broadly, and then Thomas will have a look at the regulatory approach to that. And then we have Joachim and Anne to give the perspectives from a EU and the legal expert, from an EU and a legal expert level, and then hopefully have a great discussion afterwards. So I would like to hand over the floor to Fabian to start today. As I said, please don't be shy with questions. I will do my best to try to incorporate them in the discussion, and I hope you all enjoy this event today with us. Thanks. Floor is yours, Fabian.
All right, thank you very much, Robert. Thanks for having me. Let me quickly share my screen. You should be able to see it now. Could somebody please give me a quick feedback?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Right, so I'm looking forward to the discussion later on. I think it's a highly relevant and very interesting topic for today. And I just try to set the stage, give you some background, foundation that we actually can use later on to discuss various things that build on this DeFi space. So I'm going to talk about decentralized finance on blockchain and smart contract-based financial markets. And it's actually the same name as the title of a paper I've recently published with the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis in their review journal. And it's just a broad overview on the DeFi space, what's going on and exactly what is new. For this talk today, I have 4 parts. I start with a very quick primer, with a very brief overview of blockchain and smart contracts, because these are the essential building blocks. That's what we need to understand the space. Then we will quickly talk about what DeFi actually is, why you should care, so basically what is new. And then I will very briefly touch on the regulation. This is basically then the segue to Thomas Dünser's part. So let's start with the quick primer. First, what we need is, of course, blockchain technology, because everything you're about to hear is built on blockchain, on public blockchains, to be more precise, to be more specific. And when you think about blockchain, you have essentially 3 building blocks. Number one, what you need is a peer-to-peer network. So you must be aware that we're not talking about a network where there is a centralized node where everyone connects to. It's really this peer-to-peer network where anyone can connect to pretty much any other node. So you download the client, you have a connection to anyone else, and the transformation is just shared freely between these different nodes. So no structure whatsoever, no central point of failure, no central point of attack, and that will be really important. Number 2, we have public crypto in there. So I'm sure you have heard about the private key. Essentially, you can think of it just as your password. The idea here is that you can guarantee transaction integrity and transaction authenticity. And that is the second part we need to establish a blockchain. So a way for people to sign their transactions, a way for people to prove that the transaction has actually originated with them. And then when you think about it, when everyone just has his own or her own ledger, her own copy of the ledger, the last thing we need is a so-called consensus protocol. That's a somewhat complicated sounding word for something that is actually quite easy. The idea is when everyone has a copy of this ledger, how can you ensure that all of these ledgers are in sync, that these copies are all equal, that they all have a common understanding of the current state? And these are the building blocks we need for a blockchain. And essentially, when you have all of these building blocks, it may, depending on the specifics of the architecture, that's really important, especially when we talk about regulation later on, it may create an open and immutable ledger. So it may create this database that is shared, that is managed by a community instead of just one person or one entity. And the second thing are smart contracts. When we talk about smart contracts, many people have severe misconceptions and they don't really seem to understand what it actually is. Now, what a smart contract really is it is just a snippet of code. It is a script that you deploy on the blockchain. So you have certain rules, deterministic rules you put on the blockchain, and then you can observe these rules. You know exactly what is in there, and you know for 100%, with certainly 100%, that these rules will be executed. So in contrast to other process automation, and in contrast to things you potentially see with a financial intermediary, here you can observe the code, so you know exactly what is going on. You can verify the execution. And what is really important is that these smart contracts, they have an address of their own, and they can assume value, so they can store crypto assets on the smart contract. A smart contract can be the owner, and then of course the assets are subject to the conditions in the smart contract. And what you can do with this setup, when you have these rules that are encoded in the smart contract, when they can hold crypto assets, what you can do, for example, is you can create an entire exchange protocol, so a decentralized exchange just on these smart contracts. That is fascinating. So usually you have this entity, usually you have somebody who manages the order books, usually you have somebody who provides the infrastructure. Now with this technology, what you can do is you can deploy one or several smart contracts on the blockchain, and they act as a financial infrastructure, as this neutral financial infrastructure on the blockchain that can be used by everyone. The second thing, as an example, is collateralized loans. So entire lending markets where you usually have to go again through a central service provider, here you can have a protocol built on top of these smart contracts, where essentially these smart contracts act as a lending market. We can do the same with synthetic assets, for example, where we create synthetic assets of, let's say, stocks or some commodities, or you name it. You can create asset management protocols where the asset manager has to adhere to certain rules. So you're really flexible, but what is important is that you can code these rules in the smart contract and it just lives on the blockchain. So what is DeFi? I mean, the first thing you need to know is that there is no clear definition. So depending on who you ask, you may get different results, you may get different answers. My personal definition is DeFi essentially is a system that employs public blockchain networks and smart contracts to build open, transparent, composable, and non-custodial financial protocols. Now, when we look at these words one by one, open just means by default there are no access restrictions, so it's provably fair. It fosters financial inclusion, as an example. So all of these nice properties. And transparent, of course, is that it's mathematically verifiable by anyone, so you can get all the data, you can look at it, you can verify whether the execution was in fact as it was supposed to be, which is really important. You usually cannot do that in a traditional financial system, at least not on your own. Composable means that you have all of these different contracts, all of these different protocols, and they can interact with each other. As you will see later on with banking system, with financial intermediaries, you usually have silos, so individual databases, and it's really hard for these different services to interact with each other in an efficient way, and it's completely different here in the DeFi space. And then also really important, the last point, non-custodial, means that there are no trust requirements, so you don't have to deposit your assets with a certain service provider and hope that they don't run away with the money or that they don't default. Here, all you have to do is you have these smart contracts, you have specific rules in there, deterministic rules. You can observe these rules and then they can hold the assets. So the way it is built is actually in a layered infrastructure. You have the settlement layer on the very bottom that is just the blockchain. Everything you hear of all these protocols are deployed on the blockchain. Then you have something that's called an asset layer. Of course, when you have a financial infrastructure and a financial market, then you need some asset. In the blockchain space, we usually refer to these as tokens. So there is something called the ERC20 token standard for fungible tokens, and then we have the 721.1155 for non-fungible tokens. And that is really the layer where these additional assets are created to be traded. Then we have the protocol layer. Here you have all of these various protocols. So I briefly talked about exchanges, for example. So entire exchanges, asset exchanges that are built on these smart contracts. You have lending protocols, derivative markets, asset management, and you come up with basically pretty much anything you have in the traditional financial markets can be rebuilt here in a mostly non-custodial way using these smart contracts. And last but not least, you have the application and the aggregation layer. And these are essentially just the front ends. So of course, anyone can connect directly to the smart contracts via the blockchain, but most people actually use a front end where they have a nice presentation of these services, and they can easily interact with it. And that is done through the application and the aggregation layer. So why should you care? I mean, there are many reasons. I already mentioned transparency, financial inclusion. There are so many beautiful properties that you simply cannot get in traditional financial markets, novel properties, highly interesting properties that may actually solve many of the problems we face today with our financial infrastructure. But I want to give you some examples, 3 of them to be precise. The first one is, let's assume you want to partake in a lending market, let's say. And in the traditional financial system, you usually have a custodian, you have a financial intermediary, you have your asset here, this yellow coin, put it with your bank, and then you have to trust them. I mean, the entire execution, the matching, everything is just with this bank, is with this financial intermediary, and you don't really see what's going on. And really, it's a custodian you have to trust. With smart contracts, what you have is you have the smart contract deployed on there. You can observe the rules ex ante, so you know exactly what will happen. You have the entire structure there. You can observe and verify the execution. And then after you've verified everything, you can post your collateral with the smart contract, and you know exactly what will happen. So that definitely is a huge advantage. Number 2, many of the processes in the traditional financial system require a centralized clearing and settlement. And yes, it works well, but it is somewhat inefficient. There are certain delays in there. It's expensive. As an example here, when you have 2 people, this person here has a yellow token, this person has a green token. Neither of them wants to give the token to the counterparty before he or she received the other token. So you have this entity in the middle. It assumes the green token, the yellow token, and once both tokens arrive with this entity in the middle, they get exchanged. Again, it's somewhat cumbersome, complicated. With smart contracts, what you can do is you have something called atomic settlement or atomic swaps, where you have just one transaction, or you can ensure that both of these actions, so the yellow token from left to right and the green token from right to left, are inseparable. So they will get executed at the same time, and it's certain that you cannot end up in a situation where you only transfer the yellow token but not the green one. And this sounds like a side note, but it's actually super exciting and a really important efficiency gain in financial markets when you think of it. When you have this atomic settlement characteristic, that is something you can build on. That is something you can have various applications and of course efficiency gains when you don't need these clearing and settlement houses anymore. And the last thing I already briefly mentioned, that is traditionally, you have these silo services. So each bank has their own database, each bank has their own ledger. They are not really interoperable in most cases. And here with DeFi, we are really talking about programmatic composability. It's much easier to think about Lego pieces because that's essentially what it is. You have all of these protocols, but once a protocol is deployed, once you have a certain service on the blockchain, a financial service, then other protocols, new ones, can use it. So for example, when you have a decentralized exchange and somebody else comes up with a new protocol, they can integrate that decentralized exchange in their protocol. And that is super exciting and actually fosters financial innovation. So what about regulation? I mean, I hope I could get you excited. I hope you see that there is much innovation in this space with these examples, and that there are many beneficial characteristics. But you might wonder, should we regulate this stuff? What is going on? Is there a need for regulation? And from my experience, when I talk to regulators, there are really two kinds of regulators. One of the archetypes I talk to, they really want to regulate everything. So they see it and they think, yeah, we have to step in immediately, regulate it all. And then there's a second kind of regulators, and it's the exact opposite. They say, don't touch any of them. You might undermine innovation. This is really hurtful, so don't do anything. And I realize it will not be too popular what I'm about to say. It might be somewhat controversial, but I think both of them are completely wrong. Because the truth is much more nuanced than that, and it requires a lot of research. Why do I say that? Now, of course, there are completely decentralized DeFi protocols, and where you have a static smart contract that cannot be changed, you don't have any special privileges in there, where you have really just this neutral infrastructure, and that is really exciting. And I think in this case, you neither can nor should regulate. I mean, when you think about it, true decentralization can provide mutually beneficial and provably fair infrastructure, and it may decrease the need for and also the effectiveness of regulation. So in this case, it doesn't make too much sense. You don't have the access, and you also, when you think about it, many of the reasons why you potentially want to regulate don't really exist there. When you don't have a custodian, for example, when you don't have a centralized counterparty, you have much less risk. So in a true decentralized finance protocol, there might be much less need to actually regulate. So my proposal here is just go for the on and off ramps. I mean, you cannot go for the protocols. They are decentralized anyways. It doesn't make too much sense. You most certainly do not try to regulate the devs or the protocols. That would be a really bad idea. It wouldn't make too much sense, and there's no way to stop them anyways. So in this case, it's really just the on and the off ramps. But that being said, there is a different kind of DeFi and a different category, and that is called the decentralization theater. And these are really just protocols or companies. I want to show you how decentralized they are. And at the end of the day, it's just a way to get around regulation. And it doesn't have really anything to do with actual decentralization. And I think the regulator's job in the next few years will be to look at these different layers right here, to look at the protocol layers, at the settlement layers, asset layers, and determine whether something is actually decentralized or not. When it is decentralized, it may have really nice properties and it's really hard to regulate anyways. But when it's just for show, when it's decentralization theater, then of course regulators should step in. Now, I have some examples to make this less abstract. Of course, you have to go through layer by layer. And the first thing you have to look at is the settlement layer. And the question, is the blockchain truly decentralized? To go with a hypothetical example, let's say a social media platform creates their own blockchain and it's heavily centralized. Then obviously it doesn't matter what exactly you deploy on there. Then it will be centralized in any case because it just assumes the properties from the settlement layer. And then from my point of view, it should be subject to regulation in that case. And then of course, there are also parts in the asset layer. For example, when you have an off-chain collateralized stablecoin, a stablecoin that's essentially just a promise for delivery for US dollars that are stored with a bank, let's say, then it's really hard to make the argument that this is decentralized finance. Also, when you have blacklisting, expropriation functions in the token contract, when somebody has special privileges to withdraw funds of someone else, let's say, it's really hard to make the argument that it's completely decentralized. On the protocol layer, you can look for admin keys, so special privileges where someone can change something about the protocol. You can look for the government token allocation. So, for example, if there's a specific person or a venture capital fund that controls most of these governance tokens and through that controls the protocol, you have oracles, which essentially are just data feeds, and then you have so-called kill switches. So in some protocols, there are even special privileges where they can shut down or stop the protocol. And then, of course, on the application and aggregation layer, you have to look for front-end specific risks, and also for, let's say, if these front ends advertise specific assets to potential customer groups that where it may not be suitable to advertise it to. And these are really just various things you have to consider to differentiate between true DeFi, so this mutually beneficial, completely decentralized world, and essentially companies that just say they are DeFi, but when you look closely, you realize that's not the truth. It's just a way to get around regulation. So the key takeaways, number one, the interpretation of the term DeFi differs significantly. Don't just regulate or do not regulate anything because it's called DeFi. It's really important that you look closely. And that is actually the second takeaway. That would be a really bad idea if you do that. So regulators need experts that can analyze these protocols. They need experts who understand the space, and they must look closely and don't just go by the name of DeFi and think, yeah, it's a reason to regulate or not to regulate. If you want more information on that, you can follow me on Twitter. I regularly post about various DeFi topics. We have various interesting research projects in the space. And also, if you want to learn more about decentralized finance and from this overview, read that paper. You can easily find it online. As I said, that's been published with the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis review, and it is, of course, freely available online. So that's it. I'm looking forward to the discussion and your questions later on. And now to Thomas Dünzel.
Thank you, Fabian. Thomas, floor is yours.
Thank you. I try to share my screen. So can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So thank you, Robert, and your team for organizing this event. It is great to be able to discuss about the DeFi development at this time. And thank you, Fabian, for your research on the topic of DLT and DeFi in the last years and your insight in the mystery of DeFi. In my presentation, I will have a look at the DeFi phenomenon from a regulatory perspective. I want to start with the term financial market regulation. In the European Economic Area, financial market regulation is covering many topics, such as financial supervision and risk management, securities markets, investment funds, or post-trade services. Behind those topics, we find many directives and regulations you might have heard of, like the Capital Requirement Directive, e-money directive, payment service directive, Solvency II, short selling, MiFID, market abuse, prospectus, alternative investment funds, UCITS, CSD, EMIR for derivatives, and so on, and hopefully soon MiCA. So financial markets is a highly and densely regulated sector. So within the traditional financial sector, as Fabian Scher has showed you before, we see several regulated intermediaries like banks, security exchanges, insurances, portfolio managers, issuers. And on the other hand, we see DeFi applications like exchanges, lending, derivatives, on-chain asset management, and so on. What it makes confusing is that from an abstract perspective, both cover the same functions. So DeFi is not basically new. Most of the activities we see in DeFi applications sound similar to the financial market services we know from the traditional sector. It is also interesting to see that similar problems appear in DeFi, like we know from the traditional financial sector, so that such platforms or ecosystems have to seek answers. The big challenge in the discussion about DeFi is that the implementations of these abstract functions can be completely different, as we have seen in the presentation before. With DLT, we have a new technology that allows completely different organizational setups. In DeFi, risk of the traditional financial sector might not appear, whereas other risks might appear, as we have seen before in the presentation of Fabian Scher. So now I want to dive a bit deeper into the challenges. The first challenge I want to discuss with you is if DeFi applications fall under the scope of current financial market regulation. Let's take the example of a DeFi exchange. In MiFID, we find the definition of an investment firm as any legal person whose regular occupation or business is the provision of one or more investment services to third parties and or the performance of one or more investment activities on a professional basis. And investment services and activities are defined in the following list, like reception and transmission of orders, execution of orders on behalf of clients, dealing on own accounts, until operation of multilateral trading facilities. And this is defined as a multilateral system operated by an investment firm or a market operator, which brings together multiple third-party buying and selling interests in financial instruments in a way that results in a contract. So this is the legal setup we see in the wording of the financial market laws. And if we now come back to our DeFi exchange example, a DeFi exchange might have several layers, and like the settlement layer, as we have seen before, the asset layer, the protocol layer, and the application layer. And there we might see, for example, functions like order book, order matching, execution, and asset management. On the other side of the page, I have a list of MiFID activities. And as the functions of a DeFi exchange sound very, very similar to the regulated activities, the critical question is about if we find any legal person whose regular occupation or business is the provision of one or more investment services to third parties and or the performance of one or more investment activities on a professional basis. So even if the DeFi exchange is completely decentralized without any central intermediary, there might be legal persons around the exchange that can be considered. For example, the operator of a web page who provides a user interface to an order book combined with a fee. Now we can discuss if this activity falls under the scope of MiFID as a reception and transmission of orders, or a programmer who has developed a software for automated matching of orders. Even if the programmer offers the code for free, he might profit from DeFi coins of the exchange, so he can be considered as a person who executes and orders on behalf of clients. Or is a miner whose activity of verifying a transaction is rewarded with new coins? Is he an operator of an MTF according to MiFID? So I hope this makes clear how difficult it has become to clarify the application of a law. Often we have to look at some technical details to recognize if a law is applicable. So considering this lack of clarity, what are the options for DeFi projects that want to comply with our legal system? And we have two players in that game. We have the service providers or the projects that have to decide by themselves, but also the users of such platforms, if users want to use a compliant system for their investment activity, for example. So the option one is to apply for a financial market license. This would mean a high level of legal security for both the project and the users. But the process of applying for a license needs money and time, and the operation underlies strict rules which also trigger additional costs. Luckily, we have the investment firm directive in the segment of MiFID, which has lowered the burden for small investment firms. But even considering this, it might be a high hurdle for a small web page provider. And in addition, sometimes the details of the law, the regulation, or the guidelines might not be technology neutral, so that a project might risk being stopped. So the second option is not to apply for a license. And as we have seen before, the regulatory uncertainty that comes from unclear legal definitions makes the borders of financial market blurry. So if a project wants to be outside of the financial market regulation, it is confronted with a high risk of being considered to break the laws in one country worldwide, either by different opinions between authorities or officers, by involvement of legal opinions, or changing of small parameters of the project itself. And for many projects, the third option is not giving up, but trying to find a way to implement the vision. We therefore have to realize that there are possibilities to create DeFi projects outside of our legal system, like with a completely anonymous actors, so that no operator can be identified for regulation. In the lack of a better term, I name it an anarchistic ecosystem. By that, I don't want to judge this. It is just an observation. Bitcoin has been introduced and developed in the sector without any approval of a government. Nevertheless, we now can profit from the benefits of DLT in our standard ecosystem. So a third option is therefore to create a completely anonymous project to implement this outside of the legal system. So in other words, without legal certainty, or if we expand the scope of financial market laws to cover all DeFi projects, we risk to drive those applications that want to be compliant with our legal system in the anonymous sector. So after having worked with the DLT sector for many years, it is clear to me that it's not possible to stop DeFi. What we can achieve is that innovation of persons that want to be legally compliant is hindered by legal uncertainty. So, and now I want to come to the second challenge of DeFi, the regulation question. As Fabian Scher has before illustrated, it's kind of a bit different. So our financial market regulation is made to cover the specific risk of the traditional financial market setups. Many risks result from the mandatory use of intermediaries, from the complex infrastructure that was necessary to efficiently transfer money and financial instruments. With DeFi, we now see a completely different setup. No intermediaries, or maybe we have other intermediaries. We have decentralized networks. We have open source technology and so on. So the risk profile of DeFi is different, which does not mean that there are no risks combined with DeFi. But certain risks from the traditional financial market can be avoided with DeFi. So the reason for regulation might have disappeared, but there are other risks relating to DeFi which are not yet addressed by regulation, like risk relating to smart contracts, to DLT in general, because decentralized networks are used. Different risks might pop up because other acting persons like programmers, miners play a relevant role. But we have to see that the real risk profile strongly depends on technical details, so neither efficient regulation nor supervision will be easier in future. And finally, we have to bear in mind that we are in a still very early stage of development combined with a high innovation speed. So with DeFi, the risk profile looks very much different. So the typical risk of the traditional financial sector do not appear, but others, like we have just mentioned, Fabian Scher has mentioned before. I don't want to go through that, but some are really interesting to see. Maybe the most important, like the censorship of information. If somebody provides an order book of just as a web page, he can censor some information. So that's the trader or the investor does not see any every market information in the real time. Or the question, who is able to enter an order in an order book? It can be the investor himself, or a service provider, or it can be just a smart contract or so. So, and who decides about the execution of a trade? It can also be the investor himself, or a service provider, or a smart contract that has been programmed by somebody. Also, the problem of the admin key we have heard before. So that's who has the rights to delay or cancel a trade or an order. And last but not least, who is liable if a smart contract is not working properly? So there are completely different questions that appear with DeFi. Not completely different, maybe some questions we have also in the traditional financial market, but the setup is different. So finally, I want to have a slide about the strategic question. So what can we do? How can we handle with DeFi? So the very first question we have to ask ourselves is, do we want to have DeFi in Europe? Some of you would probably say, I don't care, but I am convinced that this development we can see since many years will determine the future of the financial sector, because it is more a natural evolution. With the invention of blockchain and DLT, it is now possible to create efficient financial services without traditional intermediaries. So it's not possible to go back to the times before blockchain, to my opinion. Some of the DeFi projects will help to increase the efficiency of financial markets by reducing the risks. Stopping DeFi would hinder that our economy and society would profit from its benefits. If DeFi evolves completely outside of the legal sector, we might lose control of the financial sector and also of future tax income. This may be a fun fact, but if all service providers are fully anonymous and decentralized, this might have an effect of the tax structure of our economy. But if we agree that we want to have DeFi in Europe, the next question would be, what can we do to allow DeFi? As I have tried to show in my presentation, we need more precise legal definitions to make clear what is currently covered with regulation. Another important instrument is to focus on roles rather than on a whole business model, so that innovation can happen. So this takes respect to the development we have seen in the last decades of fintech. The trend of the fragmentation of the value chain, And consequently, we should adopt our regulations so that small entities are possible. Regulation must be adequate and reasonable for each application. And after having allowed DeFi, the next stage would be what can we do to foster DeFi? One idea might be to introduce a kind of a DeFi license in the harmonized financial markets. The word DeFi license might sound like a buzzword, but maybe find a better term. But such a low-level license could be accessible for persons who are doing some form of financial market activity, but have a different risk profile than traditional entities. With that license, we could minimize the risk of breaking the laws, while the cost and the administrative burden allow also small and focused and highly automated services. Another idea is to introduce more flexibility for regulated entities. If someone is innovative and finds a way to provide a financial activity with the same or lower risk profile, he should be allowed to do so, like in a kind of a sandbox or a regulatory lab. So I hope that I could give you some insights in the challenges of DeFi, that DeFi projects and regulators are or will be facing. And I also hope that I could explain to you that DeFi is an important development of the financial system, so it is worth to have a closer look. And third, I hope that I could show you that for the future we need another approach of regulation for this development. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas, for your presentation. And now I just directly hand over to Joachim to give his views from a European Commission perspective. So please, Joachim, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Robert and the team, for having me here. And thank you, Fabian and Thomas, for the excellent presentations. I have been asked to comment on what Fabian and Thomas have said. And given that Fabian and Thomas have very well explained what DeFi is and what the part of regulation could be, especially MiFID II, I would like to focus my observations also on MiCA. And whatever I will say will be my personal opinion. So I'm not the opinion of the European Commission, but I give my personal views. I think it's useful to start with a description of the size of the DeFi sector, if we should call it like that. And we all know it's very fast growing. Figures seem to be that at the moment we have a volume of about $60 billion, 50 billion euros roughly in DeFi, which is 25 to 30 times more than it was 1 year ago. So it's certainly fast growing. On the other hand side, it is still about roughly 1/10, if at all, of the whole crypto asset space. And if we then look at the global volume of financial transactions as such, debt, equity, etc., which is in the 3-digit trillion dimension, we see that we have quite here an uphill battle for DeFi to really gain track. On the other hand side, it's very clear that we are not talking, as in previous waves of innovation, so much on volume at this stage, but we talk about innovative business models. And this is certainly where the key focus at this moment is. Much of what we currently discuss on DeFi reminds me of the discussion we had 4 years ago on initial coin offerings, ICOs. There as well, we have seen a wave of decentralized financing models, which were very innovative and which, in my personal opinion, were what actually decentralized finance is truly about. It started as a sort of crowdfunding 2.0, which is a bottom-up approach that is very innovative, that can scale if it is successful, but that remains limited in the applications where it is. And for those, that will be all of us that have been following the ICO discussions 4 years ago, you've seen that after a few months of excitement, all of that has drifted in a direction that perhaps the true believers in ICOs didn't want. Namely that because of legal uncertainty and because of many practical problems, also because of uncertainty that in part was justified, seeing some problematic cases, but to most part, in my opinion, came from deliberate concerns from the legacy system to prevent the upcoming of ICO. There was a turn given towards securitization, towards more standardized products, and towards financial instruments as such. And in a way, this is good because in order to scale up and to gain volume, you need to have the legal certainty and you need to be in a regulated space. So I agree that there's a necessity for regulation. On the other hand side, of course, if you think in more traditional terms of financial regulation, it means that a lot of the spirit of what we're talking about here in DLT ecosystems get lost. Namely, that we come still to more centralized, more regulated solutions that look ever more similar to already existing financial instruments, which in my personal opinion is not the idea behind innovation in decentralized finance. Now we have the next wave that indeed is called decentralized finance, which is a part of this decentralized ecosystem. But we also have the upcoming MiCA regulation. And everyone knows what the MiCA regulation is about. And in the last 6 months, there have been intense discussions with many people involved, many businesses involved, what the effect of MiCA could be on decentralized finance. I think in order to discuss that, one should be very aware of what MiCA actually is or should, in my opinion, be. MiCA looks very much like traditional existing financial regulation. The structure is very similar to MiFID II, to prospectus, to many other things, which is, of course, as it is a part of the European Commission's financial markets regulation, and it needs to be easily understandable for financial market players. On the other hand side, MiCA is precisely not governing financial instruments or securities as is in MiFID II. In essence, MiCA was created first and foremost to discuss utility tokens and those forms of other tokens that I would say are not financial instruments in the traditional sense. And this is a very much more decentralized approach. So that would also mean that we have a different form of governance, because traditional financial regulation had a lot of time to evolve. You have mature market, you have a limited number of players, mostly incumbents, and you have a lot of time to design tools such as MiFID II or other parts of the financial regulation. Here, we have waves of innovation, the speed of which is so high that you simply outpace every attempt to rigorously regulate such innovation. And this means that you need to have a much more flexible approach toward governance, which also means that when MiCA intends to cover all crypto assets, and our definition is very broad, and it should also have some say on DeFi, it would not mean that it has to be targeted at very specific business models, but it has to be flexible and open towards new innovation. And since we have adopted MiCA, we have at least seen 2 big hypes that, of course, were visible already before, but that have really come through. The first is DeFi, the second is non-fungible tokens. And we will undoubtedly, in 3, 6, 12 months, have new waves of innovative products of which we don't know anything or very little at this moment. So it doesn't make any sense to have a discussion whether all of this should be inside MiCA or whether that should be part of a new regulation as such. We cannot build new regulation for each wave of innovation that comes in the crypto asset space. And therefore, we have to find a way to accommodate for the situation as it is. Now, when we speak about MiCA, what I find very important is that we actually have 3 pillars, the first pillar of which is easily forgotten. Most people discuss the standard part, which is the white paper and the lenient rules that are for the publication of a white paper and then for getting the passport. And then we also have this big part on stable coins, on asset-backed assets and asset-backed tokens, on e-money tokens, etc., which is, of course, targeted towards specific business models. But we also have the first pillar, which is Article 4, which is the exemptions. And many of the things that we are discussing actually falls under the exemptions. So many small-scale products, many products that are targeted at a small community, things that are not fungible, like actually NFTs, are expressly excluded under Article 4. And this relates to the issuance. But of course, here we have the question, as has already been discussed, for the crypto asset service providers, what about them? So if you offer a service of them. Now, many people in the DeFi space seem to think that European regulation, if they are outside Europe, doesn't affect them. But of course, it affects you. And we've seen that in previous waves. And we need to make sure that we get this actually right. So we should find a way to accommodate for these products and see how we can fit it into the existing regulation by, let's say, adapting certain things on which at this stage, for obvious reasons, I cannot go into too many details. I'm completely along the lines that have been discussed that we need to look into these specific business models. Where there is true decentralization or where you are the closest to decentralization, you should, in my opinion, have the least problems in practice. And this is not the status quo at this stage, but we should try to achieve that. to fall within a space that is either exempted or is clearly regulated, and for that you need guidance. If you are a sort of fake decentralization and you are more centralized, then of course there is an issue to what extent you are or should be covered. And that applies to all parts of the DeFi universe. If you have flash loans, for example, they can have a useful function, but of course, if they are used, which is in some instances the case, to manipulate at very short notice crypto assets prices or whatever, then we obviously have a problem that needs to be discussed. The same applies to decentralized platforms. The more decentralized they are, the more welcome. But of course, if there is a fake for centralization, then there is an issue. So I think we have an urgent need to discuss in greater depth the various business models to find a way to either make it fit under MiCA, but not something else outside MiCA, or to provide guidance as to whether it is extended, whether it is excluded, not only as regards the issuance, but also as regards the services, or find a way to invite those that come up with these business models to find a way in order to be included and have some sort of entity which is within the European economic area, which of course is a difficulty for some of these projects. The bottom line, to conclude my brief comments, is, however, that we welcome DeFi. And that's also the first question that Thomas has been asked. I mean, DeFi is completely in line with a 10-year journey that we have taken after the financial crisis, or even within the financial crisis, to look for decentralized alternatives, which, because of the disintermediation, are more efficient, are more interesting to SMEs, to industry, and to small investors particularly, in order to transact more efficiently and faster. And therefore, it is a natural extension from crowdfunding to ICOs to now what we're discussing in the business models here. And there should be a political momentum that supports this, which I think we are indeed having and producing. And that doesn't mean that we need big changes in the architecture of the regulatory framework, but we need to have more fine-tuning as regards to exemplify how we can better support the uptake of DeFi within the European economic area, which in my opinion should be the objective. That's what I would like to say as a first brief comment, and I'm sure that we will have some further discussions on this later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Joachim, for the elaborate comments. And I know that Anne is already smiling because she definitely wants to comment on that as well. And I think everything else that was said. So no longer holding you back. So Anne, floor is yours.
Thank you, Robert. And thank you for the other panelists. I think perhaps we've already heard so much about regulation by now that my comments may be superfluous, but I think the topic of regulation in DeFi is so important and definitely so pertinent that perhaps we can go into a little bit more detail. One thing that has become very clear over the past few months, I think, is that, well, specifically the past few months, specifically the past few weeks, is that the legal honeymoon of DeFi is over. Just last summer, DeFi was largely flying under the radar. Now it no longer is. And Thomas asked an important question: is, do we want DeFi in Europe or not? And I fully agree with Joachim's comments that yes, we probably do want DeFi. Even if we wouldn't, it may be hard to stop it. It may be here to stay regardless of whether we want it to be here or not. But it's probably very good reasons to make sure that we look at the DeFi closely and figure out if we want, not necessarily if we want, but how we're going to have it in the European Union or elsewhere. DeFi is not just about technological capabilities, but it really expresses the zeitgeist, a changing tide. And I would echo Joachim's comments and what has been said before, that DeFi is not falling out of the blue sky, but that DeFi is really the continuation of some trends that we've seen in the past. And those trends are not just technological. I think that's important to understand. If we look at MiCA, how it targets Libra and the big tech companies coming up with new initiatives, perhaps DeFi there can be a counterforce, and therefore we have to make sure that if we target Libra or Diem through MiCA, that we make sure we don't also inadvertently target DeFi, because DeFi could be that counterforce that we perhaps need if we want to curb some of the powers that we've seen in big tech and other incumbent companies. That doesn't mean there are no risks in DeFi. I know we're very much aware of the risks and challenges that we've seen in DeFi, many of which are also available in CeFi and centralized finance. But the important thing is to zoom out, take a step back, and to think about the bigger picture of where does DeFi fit in a changing society. And I think Joachim and Thomas as well have hinted at this, but can we accept that something remains unregulated? the approach of MiCA is very much, we want to make sure we cover all the crypto assets, but as Joachim has said, with exemptions and things that are not necessarily covered by MiCA. But the main approach was, well, if we have crypto assets in the European Union, we want to make sure that somehow they're covered by the financial legislation that we have, or by MiCA, even though we have these exemptions, these important exemptions in MiCA. And the Financial Action Task Force takes a similar approach, saying if it's a financial asset in a traditional way or a virtual asset, we want to make sure it's covered somehow by FATF's guidance. But we can ask a question, if we take a step back, do we accept that something remains unregulated? And we could accept that something remains unregulated either on a temporary basis or on a permanent basis. On a temporary basis, it could be simply because we need the time to understand exactly what it does, what it means, the implications for our business models or product, also on a more on a broader scale. Or it could mean that we say, okay, we understand what it is. We just want to make sure that we wait until we intervene, until we see how the sector matures and how these business models crystallize. And that could be a reason to say we temporarily do not try to regulate DeFi. It could be that we take a permanent approach, saying, no, DeFi is so different in some respects, or certain aspects of DeFi are so different that we permanently decide not to regulate it, or not to regulate certain aspects of it. And that'd be obviously a bit more controversial. If I take an example of either one of those approaches, if we look at the UK, for example, and of course I'm teaching in UK, so I've been following that a little bit more closely recently. The UK's approach on DeFi has been, if you looked at this January of this year, the consultation that was published by the HM Treasury in the UK, it was very clearly that the focus was on stablecoins because that was seen as a main priority. And DeFi, for now, the consultation was clear, saying we're not going to regulate DeFi as such, we're just going to keep monitoring. But so that was the approach in the UK, or that is the approach in the UK. DeFi is something we'll monitor, we don't want to intervene yet. So this temporary hands-off approach. And 1 month later, February, we saw the Khalifa review in the UK that actually says, well, perhaps we in the UK want to use DeFi as a competitive advantage and make sure we keep London attractive as a fintech hub. But there was this explicit comparison between what the UK could do with DeFi and put it opposite what MiCA is doing in the EU. Of course, it's perhaps on a more basic question, more basic level, we can ask, is there something like regulatory competition if we are truly in a decentralized network? Because of course there are no headquarters to move around. But clearly at this point, we're not there yet. And clearly the UK's opinion, or the sentiment in the UK has been, we can do better than MiCA, and that we leave DeFi unregulated in the hope of attracting more DeFi companies or networks to the UK. Of course, it's not just a question of regulating or not regulating. The panelists already mentioned some other options, sandboxes, registration, and licensing opportunities that Thomas mentioned, the safe haven that have been proposed in the US. So there are temporary solutions, even if we decide to not regulate it right now, to wait and see. A more controversial step would be to say, well, we don't, on a permanent basis, perhaps we don't have to regulate DeFi or not regulate DeFi in the same way as we used to do. Although DeFi is largely based on components we know, there may be specific aspects that may make us change our mind of how we regulate it. And if we look at the recent comments from Hester Pierce, the SEC commissioner, she brought up something that may look like it's theoretical. She basically said, if we're truly on a decentralized system, then there's no information asymmetry. And we basically assume that in a traditional company, traditional financial setting, we have insiders and outsiders. So we mandate disclosure because we have this insider-outsider information asymmetry. In DeFi and truly decentralized system, we don't have that insider versus outsider. So perhaps we shouldn't think about the same type of disclosure in DeFi. That's what her comments were. Of course, disclosure has many other aims than just bridging the gap between insiders and outsiders. But the point is that perhaps these traditional concepts and traditional assumptions that we make in traditional finance may not necessarily hold for DeFi. So if we do decide we want to regulate, we don't want to wait and see, we want to regulate, then the question is, do we use the existing concepts or do we use new ones? MiCA and FATF's guidance very much rely on existing concepts. In the US, there are examples of, such as the state of Wyoming, who say, for example, we're going to accept DAOs as a type of legal entity. We're not going to force them into an existing form like traditional companies. We're going to make them a special type of company with legal entity status and with very different obligations, fiduciary duties, disclosure duties, member rights, etc. And if we do want to apply existing concepts to DeFi, then we also have to understand something important that Fabian mentioned and Thomas also hinted at, this knowing at which stack, which level of the stack we're regulating. So if we're regulating the apps on top, we're regulating the settlement layer, the blockchain layer. It's very important, I think, from a regulatory perspective to understand that stack and to know where the issues are so that we can regulate at the right level and that we understand that there are these different levels. For a legal perspective, obviously the main concern is, okay, the law uses intermediaries as a sort of legal hook, as an access point. Sometimes the law even requires intermediaries to be involved. Of course, if we say intermediaries, we typically think about legal entities, even though MiCA still relies on legal entities in its draft rules. It doesn't mean that we cannot come up with new types of legal entities. Nothing would prevent us from accepting a DAO as a new type of legal entity. But the main idea is we still use these traditional concepts of legal entity, for example. And why is that? Because of liability concerns. We have had this discussion for a long time, and how do we, I can already see in the chat that there's some questions about smart contracts, who can be held liable if there's a bug in the code. And that's basically the key question that we keep having. What is the liability? How can we impose liability in DeFi? And we've had this discussion for a while now in the literature. At first, when people were suggesting perhaps we should hold developers liable, that was very controversial, was shot down, saying we cannot do that because the whole open source community would be very guarded, and that's absolutely not what we want to achieve. But somehow FedF's guidance seems to be going in that direction with very many caveats and saying only certain conditions can developers be held liable, but still we're going that direction, or there's one step in that direction. Imposing liability on minors, I think, as a general rule, that would be very inefficient. Of course, we have to understand where are the problems and legal concerns and where are they on the legal stack, on the technology stack. If we have issues with a specific application, we can regulate the application, or as Fabian was saying, on-ramp and off-ramp. If we have issues in an underlying layer, such as if we really have concerns over front running on the blockchain infrastructure, we should regulate, of course, that layer and not necessarily the layers on top. But of course, again, in DeFi, we see that because of transparency, sometimes we can come up with solutions that do not necessarily require much more monitoring from regulators. If we look at just last week, we saw some front runners front-running the front runners in DeFi. We have front runners and people who see what's happening in the Ethereum mempool and say, okay, we're not going to let that happen. We're just going to play with the code and actually front run the front runners to stop the front runners. So that was without legal intervention, without any policing, the community itself coming up with some of these solutions. But that doesn't mean the concern is not there. It just means that perhaps the concerns are, for some with a technological eye, easier to spot and perhaps easier to identify, bring out in public, and perhaps do something about. Of course, FedF's approach is very much, well, if there's at some point there's always a centralized person. Decentralization is a spectrum. There's not DeFi and CeFi as two different silos. There's a spectrum of decentralization. As long as there's some decentralized entity, some centralized entity or person, then FedF seems to be suggesting we should go after that person potentially, whether it's a founder, a coder, an owner, whatever that means, an operator, again, whatever that means in DeFi. But I think one important point is what FedF says, and that's also the UK's position, I think, is the greatest risk is now from the significant stablecoins, Libra, DM. So that's what FedF is saying. That's what we should focus on in some respect, because simply they pose the greatest risk to mass adoption. And UK likewise focuses on stablecoins, significant stablecoins, not DeFi right now. So until we know what DeFi really does and where it crystallizes, perhaps that is a sensible approach to say, let's wait until we intervene to make sure we get it correct, that we don't have collateral damage by imposing rules without fully understanding what is an owner in DeFi, etc. So perhaps that is the correct approach to take right now. Be careful with regulation until we understand a little bit better what it means for society at large, and until we see perhaps a bit more crystallization in the DeFi space.
Thanks for that, Anne. Just now the question to Fabian and Thomas, as the other two had the chance to comment on your statements. Would you like to comment on what Joachim and Anne said? I see, Thomas, you unmuted yourself, and Fabian too, so I assume. Please go ahead then, Thomas, yes.
No, I fully agree with the things that Joachim and Anne have said. So it's I think the big challenge is to handle this in the future. So we have a the biggest, so the greatest, the greatest chance we have is just to let it develop and see how it develops. But we have to let it develop, and this is the problem I see, that it's not easy to create this setup. So,
thanks, Thomas.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add, except one thing I personally think would be a really big mistake is if you go after the developers. I think that would be horrible, would undermine innovation, would, as Thomas mentioned earlier, push them into anonymity, essentially. So I think that would be a really, really, really bad approach.
Thanks, Fabian. Looking at the Q&A section, one of the participants asked actually if it wouldn't be making more sense to take a global approach to look at DeFi and take more time to it instead of looking at it from a regional level. How could that be done? Maybe looking at you, Joachim and Thomas, as you're both working in regulators and having experience with that. Do you think that makes sense? How long would that take? Is there an advantage or disadvantage to do it on a national or regional level besides the time factor, which I think is obvious and probably is logical? So it would be nice to hear your opinion about that.
Well, because you addressed me, maybe I start, Robert. I could now be polite and speak 5 minutes about the merits of global cooperation and of aligning things at a global level. And telling me 5 minutes out of 5 minutes how naive I am, but I could do that. I won't do that. I think, of course, it would be useful and merited. And we are involved in, I would say, any global organization of relevance to discuss these matters, and that is a very useful exercise. In my personal opinion, however, we have taken a European approach, which didn't start with MiCA, which didn't start with certain things in the last couple of years, but which has been consistent for at least 10 years, and which is also reflected in other big packages that we have adopted recently, especially on data and also on our SME strategy and industrial policy. And that means that we start from a decentralized point, that data are the possession of the property of the individual. That applies to everyone, that you decide on what to do with this property, and that you should be responsible for your actions, but also be allowed to do basically anything you want, given that we take a risk-based approach. So the more risk you create for others, the more systemic this risk becomes, the more heavily you will be regulated, if at all. And this, in my opinion, works very well. And this has contributed much, in my opinion, to the success that the MiCA proposal has had. We know of the apparent shortcomings, which is natural because we adopted it in autumn of last year. So in crypto time space, this is, I would say, intergalactic time interval where a lot of things have already happened, but that doesn't take away the basic merit of that. But it is truly decentralized. And if you look at the two other business models, I would say, that exist globally, in my opinion, they are top-down. They're either state-centric or big tech-centric, but they're not really bottom-up decentralized. And therefore, I see the merit of our approach. So I think, yes, we should engage in this global approach, but we are more credible if we stick to our own line and continue to develop what we've done in the past and also adopted in the last 18 months since the new commission has taken effect. And I see the effects globally of companies that have left Europe coming to us back, of new people engaging with us, wanting to scale in Europe, and we should make that possible. And I think, therefore, we need, and I repeat that, and that is probably the last thing I say on this question, we need to make very clear to everyone, including the regulators, that in the future, a regulator and a politician and whoever works in the public sector is an enabler and not a preventer. And this means that we have to understand business models. We have to work together with industry, with the crypto sector, with everyone involved to make that happen, unless there are, of course, risks that have to be accommodated for. And we should not have the reflex to automatically think there's someone doing that, make it regulated. I can only say my personal opinion, but the whole idea as such of everyone who produces code or who programs to become a sort of entity that needs to be fully regulated, to me personally doesn't make sense. On the other hand side, people in the crypto space must understand that when you look at a smart contract, code is something different than just scribble a line in your book privately at home, because every line of code has an economic function. And if you want to encode whatever you want and disseminate it globally and think it doesn't have any effect from the public sides, go to the kindergarten and play there. But if you really do this and create an effect on others, which goes beyond your most tiny local area, you need to understand that there is a legal and economic perspective that needs to be addressed, but not in a confrontational way, but in a productive way that indeed must be seen from a productive perspective, from the perspective of the public sector being an enabler. And if we manage this, then I think we have the best elements together to have good arguments for our line and hopefully scale that globally together with partners everywhere. But we should not deviate from the bottom line that we've taken, and that is also the essence of it.
Thanks, Joachim. Thomas?
Yep, maybe I can add something from the perspective of Liechtenstein, because I mean, we have created our own law in 2000. It was entered into force in 2020, and we started with that work in 2016. And maybe, yeah, we just decided to do that because we wanted to create, we saw a problem, and the companies that came to us and had a problem with the legal certainty, and they were seeking for legal certainty. So it was kind of our job to create that. And this is, I mean, Liechtenstein is a small country, and it's only applicable in our small country, but it helped to solve those problems. And maybe it helped to give other jurisdictions an idea of how it is possible to regulate blockchain. But of course, it is necessary to have a broader scope of regulations so that companies have the same rules. So in theory, the best approach would be to have a global regulation to DeFi projects so that all have the same cross-border legal security. But it's I think this, as Joachim said, this is this is something that takes much time, and this is only possible to do in a certain restricted area. And what the EU Commission has done with Amica is really a good approach to see what happened in the member states and what are the good approaches, and to take all the best out of it and create a new approach like Amica that is possible for Europe. And this is a really fast track that the EU Commission has been done. And I think this is kind of a best approach to do that, I think. But maybe in future we have a global approach for DeFi projects. And of course, every jurisdiction that has different rules is problematic, because there's a lack of legal security for global projects. That is true.
Thanks, Thomas. I have a question from the audience that is a bit more business focused. I just want to throw it in the room, and whoever wants to, please pick it up. I'm just reading it out to get it straight from the author. Do you think about DeFi exchanges as complementary to traditional exchanges or disruptive, for example, for stock or bond exchanges? Anybody who wants to answer that question?
Sure, I can try. I mean, when you think about stocks and bonds, how they are currently structured, you still need a custodian. They are not natively on chain. So you need somebody who has them basically in custody, and then issues the token in order for them being able to be traded. And so with a current structure, when you don't have these stocks and bonds natively on chain, when they are still issued as traditional assets, it's really hard to think of a business model that would be completely decentralized. Because as soon as you have somebody who has this off-chain collateral, tokenizes it, and then it is traded on a potentially decentralized exchange, you still have the centralized component from the asset layer, so from the token component. Now, in a potential future, when maybe more and more assets go on-chain, why not? When, for example, when also dividend payments, interest payments could be on-chain, when you have the entire ownership structure on-chain, that is possible. But I think at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. I mean, for some cases, it will be really innovative, whether it's for the entire stock market or for new areas. Doesn't really matter a lot. There are certainly many interesting applications, and that's why I am so excited about this space.
Thanks, Fabian. Anybody else who wants to comment on that?
I would perhaps add that we can try to look at the future and see how far DeFi can disrupt the existing financial markets, and they definitely promise to do that and want that. Even if they don't, they're already exerting a lot of pressure on the traditional financial infrastructure. So even if DeFi never really replaces it, it still puts pressure on the existing financial infrastructure to change things, to do things faster, to do things cheaper, to be perhaps more flexible when it comes to offering terms and conditions to people, because we see in DeFi there's much more flexibility about repayment of loans and collateral and when you can withdraw your assets. So even if DeFi never replaces CeFi, one of its important function right now is not just showing that we can do things differently, but also having that pressure exerted onto the existing financial system, I think.
That's a very good point, Anne. Thanks. Another question from the audience that's specifically to you, Fabian, actually, from Johan Nesme. Sorry, if I'm pronouncing that wrong. He would like to know who will take care of the flows that come out of smart contracts. So what happens if there is an error or misconduct of a smart contract? How do you envision that to be taken care of? How should that be done? Or how could that be done, maybe, rather than should?
I mean, that really depends on how the smart contract is programmed. There are static contracts that cannot be changed whatsoever. So essentially, they are deployed on the blockchain and with specific rule set, and no one can change them. And then you also don't have any special privileges. They are just there, which is super exciting. But of course, and I think that's the direction you're going, if something goes wrong, in case there is a programming error in there, no one has the power to change them. And it's just in there. So there's also a drawback to that. Now, there is something called the proxy pattern. That's essentially when you have a contract that just forwards the call to other contracts so that you can exchange the logic. That has many advantages. In that case, you can update the smart contracts, you can update the protocols, but that, of course, introduces the question of who has the power to do so. And usually that's done through either these admin keys. So there are usually a relatively large number of people that via multisig, so you need m of n of these people to agree, can change the protocol. Or the other approach is that you have votes. So a governance system that depends on the governance tokens, and essentially everyone who uses that protocol has some votes on how to change it. But it is a really important question, and it is an unsolved one because both approaches have their pros and cons. Now, I mean, there's more to your question also. You also say, how do people react? How can you curate the system? I am a big believer in self-responsibility. If somebody decides to invest in a protocol with, let's say, an anonymous founder team with some special privileges in there, and they don't do any due diligence, and then just throw money into that protocol, that's essentially their own call if they want to do that. I mean, why I personally, I never understood that. Maybe that's naive. I don't have a legal background, but I never understood why a regulator has to step in this case. That's your personal judgment.
Thanks, Fabian, for that statement. I don't know if anybody else would like to comment on that question.
Could I perhaps add one thing? And we already talked about ICOs. I think DeFi is very different from ICOs. ICOs were so easy for any person in the retail public to participate, and that's what drew the ire of regulators, that so many people without any investment or financial literacy necessarily came en masse to these ICOs. Well, DeFi is very different. For somebody like me with a legal background or a technical background, it's not that obvious at all to start playing with DeFi. So the DeFi is not just different in the aims and the setup and operations, but also the audience that's currently engaged in DeFi. So that's also a big difference. I think we shouldn't just say, well, ICOs have been very stringently attacked or regulated, or we've seen stringent enforcement against ICOs. That doesn't mean we need to see the same path for DeFi. Right now, DeFi is geared towards a very different audience, I think, than ICOs. And that perhaps makes, I mean, what Fabian was saying, I think plays into that theme, saying, well, DeFi, if it's limited to this very specific subset of our channel audience, very much unlike ICOs, perhaps the need to step in with strict regulations is not as great as it was in a time of ICOs a couple of years ago.
Yeah, and if I may add something on, of course, when somebody advertises these protocols, let's say there's an outright scam, an obvious scam, and somebody advertises it, then of course regulators have to step in, but that is a different question.
Maybe as a follow-up question to what just been discussed, I mean, DeFi somehow democratizes the access to capital markets. The question now is, because of its complexity, will it or rather, what needs to be done to broaden the access for the general consumer, because it's highly complex, and as you say, you have to read into this. And one of our audience members also flagged that it seems to be a bit elitist to participate in that and be knowledgeable about that. What could be done to facilitate easier access of this innovation? Is there anything that maybe regulators could or should do, or is this all in the hands of the customer or the citizen?
Well, if I may, I would suggest that we discuss this in a year's or 2 years' time, because I don't buy into this story that things are difficult to understand or elitist. If we look at technological developments, not only over the last decades, but even in longer historical perspective, you see a lot of things that have emerged elitist or for only very few, and then have been democratized, but in a way that people still don't understand what the technology is about. Who understands their smartphone? Who understands the internet? Who understands their computer? I was responsible for a long time for access to finance for small and medium-sized enterprises. 98% of European enterprises are SMEs. The large majority of them is not high-tech, and no one understands what we're discussing here, but at a certain moment, they will all use it. Deeply convinced in that. And therefore, what we have to do is education. We have to tell people what all this is about, to take the fear away that indeed people don't understand it and therefore it doesn't work. And we have to find trustworthy partners to do that. And with trustworthy partners, I don't mean discredited member of the legacy system that just want to prevent innovation, but I mean people that have a track record of indeed enabling things and make that happen, especially for small non-tech enterprises and citizens as such, including those that want indeed to invest their money in a responsible way, but think that as I do, it is my own money, so I should be the one who is responsible for actually spending my money on things that I like, of course, seeing a need for preventing the worst excesses that there are. And then I think the path of DeFi that we see now, that it is indeed very difficult to understand, that even people like myself sometimes have difficulty in understanding what a flash loan is about or what a good purpose would be. I mean, people tell me a lot of bad purposes, but I'm sure there must be good purposes. All of that depends on the business models really to demonstrate, and that is the burden of proof actually with the sector, that this has effects. And if that has positive effects, then I think the public sector should also invest in disseminating good practice, in making this known. And otherwise it will not happen, but the public sector is not the market. It is for the market, first of all, to come up with it and see if there's a certain merit. And if that is, then it is about scaling also from our side. But the bottom line of all of that is first education, second education, third education. A lot of events like this, going to the technology, making the right people understand what it is about, and then finding the applications. And if you really want to convince policymakers, regulators, you need to do it via use cases that are useful in a sense that you spend public resources on them.
Thanks, Joachim. Thomas, you're unmuted, or is this by accident?
No, it's by accident, but maybe I can answer also to the question about how to regulate, how to create this certainty. I mean, we have several concepts of creating trust in financial markets participants. One is, of course, that the competent authority is checking if every legal requirement is there, and so that they check if in the name of the clients, if this company is trustworthy, and this is what the traditional way to do that in a DeFi ecosystem. I think this is far too early to do that, because for that the officers have to understand the technology better than the users, and this needs time, but they can be educated. This is true, but there are also other concepts. But first of all, I mean, in the current phase of out of DeFi, it's more experimental. So those persons that are able to use that technology should test that and use that. And as soon as it is open to the public and it's relevant for the public, then we can think about how to regulate. There are other concepts could also be kind of a decentralized supervision. Maybe we find something that it's not necessary to have a centralized concept of supervision and regulation, but another way. But this takes time and to find any answer.
Thanks, Thomas. Maybe generally asking a question on what should regulators that are not so familiar with the concepts and the topic yet, from your perspective, as you're all dealing with that on a regular basis or daily basis, what kind of mindset they should bring to the table looking at this, you know, because a lot of them grew up in a traditional financial services environment. They grew up with traditional banking or asset management or financial market infrastructure. What is the new thing that you would like to give them, basically, like, you know, maybe as a farewell gift of this webinar, looking at the time also, that you would hope that they will start with looking at this? Maybe we'll start, I don't know, with Anne this time, if you could have a wish list or a wish.
I think the important word that has already been mentioned a couple of times is learn about it first. And it's for me as a lawyer, I can see how hard it is to step away from the known concept that's been drilled into our head for such a long time. And that's why it's important to really delve into it. It's not obvious to delve into it to such extent that you really start understanding to what extent your existing legal concepts and your existing legal education fits or doesn't fit what we're seeing right now. And to some extent, there is a good fit, and there are the same concerns and there are the same solutions we could find, and to some extent there aren't. So of course, for us, if for me, coming from a securities law background, everything looks like a security, and that's perhaps the mindset with which we come to the table. And it takes a lot of delving into something new and really keeping that open mindset to understand, well, perhaps not everything is a security, and even if it could fit our definition, perhaps it shouldn't. I'm just talking about securities law, but there's so many other laws that could apply to DeFi. So even though it requires us, first of all, we need to learn a lot. It requires a thorough commitment to be willing to learn about what it is. And secondly, not just see how laws could apply, but also should they apply, and to what extent does a law fit into a broader, bigger picture question of what are the aims we're trying to achieve, and could DeFi perhaps help achieve those aims in some respects, even though it may challenge those aims in other respects.
Thanks, Anne. Maybe Fabian, if you have a wish or a wish list.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I completely agree with Anne, and I also will be repeating myself because I already gave my wish list at the end of my talk. I think it's really important that before taking action, regulators try to understand what's going on and realize that it's highly interdisciplinary. So it's from my perspective, it's impossible to talk about legal questions if you didn't look at the computer science topics, if you didn't look at the economics topics. It's highly interdisciplinary, and you have to have a background in all of the involved subject matters. That's really important. And also, I mean, when you look at the layers, try really to understand how it works, try really to understand where exactly something happens, why it happens, and also why you should or should not regulate. So look at it, education. I think that's the big word.
Thanks, Fabian. Joachim, anything to add?
Just to rephrase it, I mean, I fully share the views expressed, but what I would say, indeed, to put it in a different context, is listen to your children. The average 14-year-old is better placed to discuss these questions than the average 44 or 54-year-old, because they grow up with this. And the fact that you have not learned it at school when you were young doesn't mean that it is nonsense. This, what we are talking here today, is the reality in 10, 20, 25 years, whatever. And the question is not whether you like it, but whether it will happen with you or without you. And therefore, get on board, try to understand what they are doing. If you don't have children, go to university and talk to students. Try to understand what they are doing and make it happen.
Thanks, Joachim. Thomas?
Yeah, it might sound a bit boring if I repeat the same things, but we don't discussed it before, but obviously agree on the education topic. Maybe I just can add one example of the education of authorities. And we had introduced a regulatory lab and a fintech team in Liechtenstein some years ago, and they are just educating themselves on practical use, and this is very relevant to understand the real risks and the chances of this development. And even then, it's a challenge to see to understand every new technology. So it's really a technology-driven complex development that needs kind of education answer also by the governments and authorities. And this is my wish too, that before to discuss about regulation, we need to understand that very deeply.
Thanks a lot. Looking at the time, I would like to thank everybody for participating today and taking the time for the panel. I hope it was an interesting conversation also for the audience. Thanks for joining in such huge numbers today. We really appreciate that. The video will be also online on our website. So in case you would like to share this with any colleagues that unfortunately missed it, that would like to learn more about it, I'm pretty sure in case you would like to read about the research of Fabian or Anne, they will be happy to share it with you, or if you go on their universities pages, I think you can also find them. Both work on that for quite a while and drafted some very interesting articles about it. And to Joachim and Thomas, thank you for doing the work at the regulatory level. We appreciate that. And I hope we'll see more and more of your colleagues, not just in Liechtenstein, obviously, but at the European level, to take more time and look at this more closer, because I think we're at an important point in history where we can really take a great leap forward when it comes to financial markets and financial innovation. And I think the biggest mistake we can do nowadays is to rush it. And then I think, as you all echoed, basically, taking the time to educate yourself and then doing the right thing is the right way forward. And I hope that was the first step for all of you to get an idea of what is new about DeFi. We will have another webinar next month. You will get some news on that as well. If you haven't done that yet, please follow us on Twitter, and I wish you all a nice evening or afternoon, depending on where you're tuning in. And again, thanks to my panel for the great discussion, and have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of you. Have a good day.
Thank you for organizing.
Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.